Hey everybody. So I've been talking a lot lately about, depth moves at the trading deadline and playoff teams adding depth players and really bolstering their bottom six and their defense cores heading into the playoffs. And, we've seen Nashville make big, the trades for Brian Boyle and Cody McLeod. Then Montreal followed that up by going and adding Nate Thompson. And I think we're going to see a lot more trades like that before and at the trade deadline as, non-playoff teams are selling off these veteran guys whose contracts are up, and they don't really have much use for them at this point because they're not going to the playoffs. There's nothing to be gained there. They're probably going to leave into free agency at the end of the year anyway, so might as well get something for them. While on the other hand, you have these playoff teams who are gearing up for playoff runs. They need depth. They need to add guys, make their bottom six better, make their defense core better. And depth is something that is obviously very, very important heading into the playoffs. You can't go into the playoffs with 12 good forwards and 6 good defensemen. It's too difficult. It's too hard. It's too physical. You're going to have injuries. People are going to be out of the lineup. Guys are going to get banged up. You have to have extra players who can play at solid minutes as well when they're called on. So if you're a playoff team looking to make a deep playoff run, you need to have at least 1 or 2 extra forwards who you can put in your lineup and still feel good about and not be worried about them, not being able to play at that level. And same thing on defense. You have to have at least 7, if not 8, quality NHL defensemen. And now you're obviously not going to have 8 star defensemen, but you need to have some extra guys who you don't worry about putting in a bottom six or a bottom pair role. And they're guys that you can put in and say, all right, he's going to be fine. We have solid extra guys here. Because the playoffs are just so physical and just so demanding that your depth get tested every single year in the playoffs. It doesn't matter if you play 1 round or if you play 3 or 4 rounds. Your depth is going to get tested. So I went through and looked at some of the bottom teams in the NHL, and I picked some depth players that I think are very likely or certainly could be moved at the trading deadline from these non-playoff teams to a playoff team because obviously I think there's going to be a lot of these kinds of moves where teams don't necessarily go out and get the big fish. There's only so many high-end players out there. And the cost for them might be very high for some of these teams to make. I think we're going to see teams in a lot of cases bolstering their bottom pair defense, bolstering their fourth lines, and adding guys who may be healthy scratches on a night-to-night basis, but can step in when needed if an injury is to occur. So I put a list together here, and this is by no means the only players of this kind that could get moved, and none of these players are certainly not guaranteed to get moved, but these are guys who generally are veteran players on expiring contracts or near expiring contracts and are on bad teams that I think could benefit a playoff team this season. So first up is Ben Lovejoy from the New Jersey Devils. Lovejoy is a bottom pair defenseman, a 7th defenseman at this point. But when what playoff team doesn't want to bolster their defense heading into the home stretch of the season and into the playoffs? Almost every single playoff team, all 6, probably 14 out of 16 of them, will be looking to bolster their defense. And Ben Lovejoy is a guy who can do that for a lot of these teams. He doesn't have to. He doesn't have to play on a nightly basis. He can be a 7th defenseman, but he's been around the league for a long time now. He's a veteran guy, and he can come in and give you solid minutes as 13, 14 minutes a night as a bottom pair defenseman. And if you happen to lose somebody, if you lose a defenseman in the first round, he can come in and step in, and it won't be that big of a deal, and he can at least play decent enough minutes there. So I think, New Jersey's a rebuilding team. They've had a really bad year this year. They've already moved Brian Boyle, obviously, in Nashville, as we've talked about. Lovejoy's on an expiring contract. He's probably not coming back to New Jersey, so then why not move him at the deadline? And I could see any number of playoff teams adding Ben Lovejoy as a 6th or 7th defenseman heading into the playoffs. We got 3 guys from Florida here. Now, Florida's had a really disappointing season, but they're not going to the playoffs this year, even though a lot of people thought they would be, myself included. They are not going to the playoffs this year, so they have guys that they can unload on expiring contracts. Riley Sheahan is the first one. He came over from Pittsburgh in the Bugstad deal. Florida's going to flip him and move him. Now, Derek Brassard is another one, but he's not on this list. I'm focusing on depth players here, 4th liners and bottom pair defensemen. So Derek Brassard, I think, is a little bit higher than that in the lineup, which is why I'm not talking about him, or other players of that type who I think could play on 2nd or 3rd lines on some teams. So I'm talking about, bottom 6 forwards and bottom pair defensemen here. So Sheahan, I definitely think will get moved. Great center, can play center or wing, depth guy, and really good depth guys. Somebody is gonna want him to really boost that bottom 6, and he does a lot of really good things when he's in the lineup. Troy Brouwer. Now Brouwer, his play has really fallen off over the last few years. He is not the player that he used to be. Offensively, especially, his offense is almost completely gone away. But he's a veteran guy. He's a really good guy in the locker room. He's a Stanley Cup winner. He's been through the playoff grinds many, many times before. He would be a good guy to bring in just based on having him in the locker room. He wouldn't even have to play a shift for his new team for him to help. He's just a great guy to have in the locker room and a leader and a veteran on the team. And I think anybody going into the playoffs, especially some of those wild card type teams, could really, really improve with adding Troy Brouwer. And then if he does play, he can be a 4th line guy. The offense isn't there anymore, but he can still give you 4th line minutes. He's a big body. He can throw his weight around. He'll drop the gloves if he needs to. He's a physical player, and certainly someone who can help out a playoff team in the playoffs. And certainly the locker room presence in itself is just incredible from Brouwer. So, look for many different teams. I think of Dallas. I think of Minnesota could really add someone like this. I think Colorado could definitely would definitely improve with a guy like Brouwer added in that locker room. Although Colorado now, they've faltered so much. Are they really, is Colorado going to make the playoffs? It doesn't look like it at this point. So we'll see Colorado is going to be an interesting team at the deadline. Do they still think they're going to make the playoffs? Are they going to be full buyers, or do they maybe kind of hold pat a little more because at this point, it's going to be hard for Colorado to catch St. Louis or Minnesota or Dallas to get in a playoff spot. San Jose, I think, could really benefit from a guy like Brouwer, a veteran guy, although San Jose is not lacking in veteran leadership or anything. But their bottom 6 could use an upgrade, and I think Brouwer would be a good guy to bring in and see what he can do. And if he doesn't play, you at least have him in the locker room. If he does play, then he can give you good 4th line minutes. And another guy from Florida, and this is, I'm really looking at the Central Division here, and that's Michael Haley. And I'm going to talk about Michael Haley and Kyle Clifford at the same time because I think they're very similar type players. Haley's a fighter. Clifford hasn't been fighting as much the last couple of seasons, but he's still a fighter. Clifford's a little bit better offensively than Haley. Clifford's a guy who can actually play and give you good playing time, whereas Haley's more of just a fighter and a physical guy. But Florida's not going to the playoffs. The Kings have been a disaster this year. So those are 2 guys that could certainly get moved. And With Nashville adding Cody McLeod, I think that sets up for some other Central Division teams to add some toughness as well. Because when you look at the Central Division, the two best teams are clearly Winnipeg and Nashville. Those are your best teams in the Central, and it's not close. Winnipeg is a very, very physical team. They have a huge defense, a very physical defense with Bufflin, Trouba, Tyler Myers, Kulikov, Ben Sherratt's a physical guy. Like, Winnipeg will rock you with their defense. And up front, Winnipeg's just a big team. You look at them up front, they have Adam Lowry. They have Brendan Lemieux playing a regular fourth-line role in the lineup now and playing pretty well. And they have Brandon Tanev, who's a smaller guy but an energy guy and willing to throw his weight around. Winnipeg's a very tough team. And, they're just a big physical team, and when you get in a playoff series with them, it is going to be big boy hockey. Same thing with Nashville. Nashville, they have, they've added Brian Boyle, they've added Cody McLeod, they've had Ryan Hartman. Austin Watson is suspended indefinitely with substance issues. I would assume that he's probably not coming back this year, but if he were to come back this year, then you would have Watson, McLeod, Boyle, and Hartman all on that Nashville team. The Central Division, you're going through at least one of Nashville or Winnipeg. You're going to have to go through one of those teams to go anywhere in the Central Division. So if you're a team like St. Louis or Minnesota or Dallas, who is going to have to go through those teams to go anywhere in the playoffs and probably play one of those teams in the first round, you have to look at adding some physicality and some size to compete and gear up for a playoff series with those two teams. So, I think that guys like Haley and Clifford may not be wanted by everyone heading into the playoffs. That kind of player might not be necessary, especially in the Eastern Conference. They're probably not necessary. But when you look at the Central Division and the toughness and size and physicality that both Winnipeg and Nashville have, you're going to have to compete with that to try even attempt to get past them in the playoffs. So if you're St. Louis has Pat Maroon, but other than that, they're a little bit lacking in the physicality department. Robert Bortuzzo can be, but he's not always the most physical player. Same thing with Joel Edmondson. I think he can be physical, but sometimes he just shies away from that a little bit. So I think up front, I think St. Louis could definitely get some fourth line help from adding a physical fourth liner, Haley or Clifford. There you go. So Dallas, I think especially could use one of these guys. They brought back Jamie Oleksiak on the back end, so he gives them some good toughness on the back end. However, up front, they don't really have anyone who drops the gloves all that often. They don't have many overly physical forwards in Dallas. I mean, Jamie Benn is one of the most physical players on the Dallas Stars, and he's your top-line winger. I mean, he's a superstar player for you, and he's one of your most physical players. I think Dallas could greatly benefit from adding, even Troy Brouwer would greatly help Dallas, but certainly someone like Haley or Clifford. Again, they don't have to play on a nightly basis. Just have them in your arsenal. So when if you have to play a team like Winnipeg or a team like Nashville, which you will in the Central, if you're going to go anywhere in the playoffs, you have them at your disposal, and you can scratch them all you want, and then if the time comes, you can put them into the lineup in a fourth line role. Minnesota, I think is in pretty good shape as far as toughness goes. They have Marcus Foligno, they have Matt Hendricks, they have Nick Seeler and Greg Patterin on the back end. I think Minnesota's okay physically, and probably out of Dallas, St. Louis, and Minnesota's probably the most physical of those three and most ready to deal with a team like Winnipeg or Nashville physically. Minnesota's issue is offense. So I don't see Minnesota going after anyone like a Kyle Clifford or a Michael Haley, because I think their moves are going to be focused on adding some offense, because if they don't get some more goal scoring, they're not going to be able to offensively keep up with those teams. So there's Haley and Clifford. I think the Central Division in particular would be looking at those two. Adam McQuaid from the New York Rangers. Again, physical defenseman, depth defenseman, somebody who can be a number 7 or can play on the bottom pair. The Rangers aren't going to the playoffs this year, so they're not going to keep him. McQuaid's contract's up at the end of the year, so I think there are a number of teams looking to add defensive depth who could be taking a swing at Adam McQuaid, and we'll see what the Rangers can get for him. But I think there are a large number of teams who are interested in adding defense, and McQuaid is a guy that should be on the open market. Another defenseman that should be on the market is from the LA Kings. It's Oscar Fantenberg. Again, the Kings going nowhere this year. He has an expiring contract at the end of this year. He's probably not going to go back to LA, I wouldn't think. I think the Kings are probably getting ready to go into full rebuild mode. So Fantenberg's probably not going back. Again, somebody, depth defenseman, bottom pair, 7 or 8 guy. Just add depth going into the playoffs. Once again, Michael Del Zotto, the defensemen keep on coming. These are the kinds of depth defensemen that seem to always get moved at the deadline to go and be a number 7 or be a number 6 somewhere, and just give a playoff team added depth on the back end. Del Zotto has already been moved once this year. He's probably going to get moved by Anaheim again, and he could just come in and give you some added depth on the back end. Derek Grant, also from Anaheim. I mean, Anaheim, obviously, it's been a terrible season for them. They just fired Randy Carlyle. They won last night in their first game without Randy Carlyle as a head coach. But, this team's not going to the playoffs or anything. So, Derek Grant is a depth forward, a fourth-line guy. He can play center or wing. He can bolster your bottom of your lineup, and he's probably most likely to be a healthy scratch most of the time, and then if someone happens to get injured, you can throw him in, and I think there are a number of teams that would be interested in him. And lastly is Alex Chiasson. He's had a great year with the Oilers. The Oilers have not had a great year, but Chiasson has 17 goals for the Oilers this year. He's been playing top 6. He's spent a lot of the time playing top 6 minutes with Edmonton this season. But for me, I'm counting him as a bottom 6 forward, because I think if he goes to a new team, he's not going to be in the top 6 on a playoff team. He's on the top 6. He's in the top 6 in Edmonton because Edmonton isn't good. If he goes to a new team, he's going to be playing on the 3rd or 4th line most likely. Probably the 3rd or what? I'm sorry, I'm completely losing my train of thought here. He can be a 3rd-line guy. He'd probably be a 3rd-line guy on any new team that he goes to. But 17 goals this year. He can give you good secondary scoring. He's not a huge guy, but he does play physical and can throw his weight around, and certainly can go to the front of the net and grind in the corner. So really good guy, playoff-type player to have on your team. Edmonton doesn't need him at this point because they're not going anywhere this season. So I think Chiasson would be a good add for many teams. So this video is already a lot longer than I thought it would be. But those are just some depth players that I think could very well get moved at or before the deadline this year from these non-playoff teams to playoff teams to help bolster their depth as they head into the postseason and gear up for a Stanley Cup run. So there are obviously more players than that. Those are just some that I picked out quickly looking through rosters and contract situations. And there's no guarantee that these guys necessarily will get moved, but I do think there'll be trade talks involving them. And there are obviously others out there as well. So with that, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media. Check out offthewallhockey.com. All those links are down in the description below. If you'd like to further support the channel, the links to our Patreon and merchandise store are down in the description as well. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.